Okay, let's get started. All right. Phew. Okay. Hello, my name is Victoria Yelton, and I decided to do my EDU 316 classroom library assignment on the Blueford High series. So to start off, I want to kind of touch base on the books in the series that I decided on. Now, the Blueford High series does have a multitude of books, but I did choose the first eight to cover on this assignment. So the first book on your far top left would be Lost and Found by Anne Schraff. And then you have A Matter of Trust by Anne Schraff, Secrets in the Shadows by Anne Schraff, Someone to Love Me by Anne Schraff, The Bully by Paul Langan, The Gun by Paul Langan, Until We Meet Again by Anne Schraff, and then Blood is Thicker by Paul Langan and D.M. Blackwell. So, kind of to start off, I wanted to touch base on what exactly the Blueford High series is, just so we have a little bit of context and background when we're going into this assignment. So, the Blueford High series is basically a collection of books that are based in Southern California at a fictional high school called Blueford High. And the purpose of these pieces is to basically highlight the struggles and experiences of a very diverse student body and kind of highlight how each character overcomes and handles their issues with racial inequality and also those personal challenges that they're facing. And I found this information off Blueford.org where they're kind of covering and doing a little bit of an overview on their series as a whole, which I did cite underneath my text. So next I want to talk about the inclusive representation that is present throughout the collection of books that I chose. So the books that I chose from the Blueford High series represent characters from a primarily Black background. But I will say that the series does kind of fall short at the representation of other races and cultures. So the protagonists of our books in the Blueford series that I chose are first and foremost Darcy Wells. She is the main character of the book Lost and Found, A Matter of Trust, and Until We Meet Again, and she is depicted as an African American girl. Next, we have Roland Bailey. He is the main character in the book Secrets in the Shadows, and he is depicted as an African American boy. Next, we have Cindy Gibson. She is the main character in the book Someone to Love Me, and she is depicted as an African American girl. Next, we have Darrell Mercer. He is the main character in the book The Bully, and he is depicted as an African American boy. And then we have Tyree Hobbs. He is the main character in the book The Gun, and he is depicted as an African American boy. And then finally, we have Hakeem Rendell, and he is the main character in the book Blood is Thicker. He's depicted as an African American boy. So the eight books that I chose are pretty well rounded in their appreciation and representation of Black communities and experiences, and they kind of give readers insight onto these issues and how these characters face these problems and how the lives in which they lead have shaped their outlook on the world. I will say though that the series does lack in accurately representing any other race or culture, religion, or physical/cognitive ability, as its focus primarily lies on the protagonists and their companions, all of which are Black. So this representation is profound and it is necessary, but I do think that the works would benefit immensely just from showing how diverse society is, maybe adding in a few more differing races. Just kind of like I said, showing that diverse society and the diverse nature of urbanized school settings. Next, I wanted to touch base on the female representation that is present throughout my collection of books. So these books I've chosen from the Blueford High series represent females as very strong and opinionated, but the books still highlight their necessity for male relationships, which I am not the most huge fan of. So we can see that the key females introduced throughout the books are Darcy Wills, Jamie Wills, Cindy Gibson, Amberlyn Bailey, Tara Carson, and Lizelle Mason. So this series does do a pretty good job at outlining and emphasizing the experiences and achievements that these female characters have made, but I do find it important to note that many of the girls throughout the series are kind of placed into that wanting to be with a male character and kind of feeling like that's a purpose for them. Now, I will say that this is a pretty key trait in many high school girls, and the book series does a pretty good job of outlining this characteristic. I think that the books would have been just fine, and these girls would have been just fine without that necessity of highlighting them to need to have male counterparts and relationships. With this being so, while the book does talk about those female-male relationships and kind of highlights those, the book still does ensure that readers can see the breakthroughs and challenges that these female characters are facing. So, for example, in the first book, We can see that Darcy and Jamie Wills must deal with the issues of taking care of their ill grandmother, as their single mother who must work to make ends meet can't really be there all of the time. As well as this, they're shown to be dealing with the reintroduction of their estranged father, doing all of such while also facing these issues of high school drama, gang and gun violence, and domestic assault. So, kind of furthering into that female struggle and the female representation that these book series placed, I want to talk about a little bit about the violence that was portrayed in here, especially towards the women of the series. So, we can see that Darcy and Jamie Wills, who are primarily highlighted in the first and second book, along with Cindy Gibson, who is the main character of the fourth book, are pretty faced with violence throughout this series, whether that be sexual or physical. And this is typically from male characters throughout the contents of these books. But these books do very well in examining and allowing readers to understand the characters' thoughts on these issues and how they're kind of overcoming the traumatic nature of what they went through and the assaults that they were faced with. Next, I want to talk about the depiction of people of color throughout the series that I had chosen. So, the books I chose from the Blueford High series represent people of color as main characters and give them pretty complex storylines and experiences. So, each main character and protagonist throughout this collection are people of color, and they're depicted in a pretty positive light, and they're given complex stories, challenges to overcome, positive experiences to triumph in, and thorough relationships. In the same breath, however, some of these characters of color are villainized and they're kind of depicted in a negative light. Now, I will say that this is primarily since the series focuses in on the experiences of Black students at a predominantly Black school. So each and every character in this series is pretty much African American. But in that same breath, you'll see that any kind of bad instance that is done is also done by a person of color. So this is a little bit complexing as the book is trying to ensure that the Black community are shed in a good and positive light. But then in the same way, they're also kind of villainizing some of the other Black characters to enrich the story and kind of show how those struggles must be dealt with by the main characters. For example, we can see in the second book, A Matter of Trust, that a shooting occurs and a group of Black students actually shoot fire at another Black student. And so we're kind of seeing that issue. But I do see that the series' primary hope was to bring overall awareness and insight into a community of people that are way too often undermined, and then also still try to bring realism into that picture. There's very many benefits to this series' depiction of color. However, the series does to hold its undeniable faults. Next, I want to talk about the depiction of families throughout this series. So, the books I've chosen from this series depict families in a pretty complex way, and they kind of differ from that status quo of a nuclear family where a mother and a father and children are always present. So, my series likes to ensure that families are not always represented in a very nuclear way. For many people for many people, this is not always the case. So many families deal with a multitudes of issues, whether they be interior or exterior. So it's always important to show representation of families who aren't in that status quo. And this kind of just proves to readers that if they're not part of that family norm, then there's nothing wrong with them. The books that I chose for this collection depict very rarely a very nuclear family. Rather than this, families are depicted in a less straightforward way, whether it be a single widowed mother raising her children, like Darrell's mother in The Bully, or an unmarried mother with a boyfriend, as depicted in Someone to Love Me. These setups are very normal and should be recognized and appreciated, as love does still typically run very deep throughout these families. I found that the series does pretty well in showing this and ensuring readers get a look into differing ways that families are depicted, as much as literature likes to turn a blind eye to the fact that there are very many different family setups than just your plain old nuclear family. Next, I want to talk about the storylines of this series. So, these books that I have chosen kind of focus in on storylines and experiences from a certain racial identity and financial class and kind of highlight their conditions in the context of their kind of institutionalized inequality. So much of the storylines throughout this collection kind of home in on those experiences of low-income Black students and kind of show the conditions they live in and the experiences that they go through are more than likely a direct reflection of that systematic inequality that they've been forced to face, their parents have been forced to face, and so on and so forth. So most of these characters throughout the contents of the series kind of live in those low-income apartments with unsatisfactory conditions. But these books take these issues and kind of show how they trickle further down than merely just those living situations, and rather that the systematic oppression that's been set up for those of color has kind of caused these diverse communities, especially within this specific series, to turn towards kind of issues like gang violence, gun violence, and drug use. The book does highlight these issues, as I had previously noted in the second book. A Matter of Trust, the character Roland Bailey is actually shot in the head by gang affiliated members. So, next, I want to talk about the harmful stereotypes that might be at play throughout this series. So the books that I chose do pretty well to not fall into many of those harmful racial, gender-based, or ethnicity-based stereotypes. However, I kind of find the depiction of females throughout this series to be slightly harmful. So I do think that the collection does a pretty well-rounded job of depicting Black characters. I can't say from firsthand experience, and I don't want to, say, oh, I completely believe that their depiction is accurate, as I am a white woman, so I don't know the direct and 100% Black experience. But I don't feel like it is very common for this book series, as I was reading it, to kind of fall into those harmful stereotypes that you see many people doing. Um, and they kind of try to ensure that this community is not shown in a negative light. So the series kind of wants to ensure that each character is kind of given that respectful and realistic storyline and doesn't kind of fall into those basic status quos onto the Black experiences and what people kind of assume them to be. Along with this, the series does tell the low income state for many of these characters, but it doesn't really say that there's anything wrong with them being low income. Rather, it's just kind of simply stating that that's the place that they're in. The only note that I have on these depictions is for that of the females. I do feel like at times the books did seem to depict the physical appearance of these women throughout the series in a pretty forward way, kind of speaking of the sexual appeal of their body types, whether or not they were heavy set, or how their clothes clung to their bodies. Now, I do feel like it's important to talk about these issues at times, but I do feel like the series could have taken a different route when kind of addressing those physical depictions of these girls. Next, I want to talk about the authenticity of this book series. So the books that I chose from this series do well to be pretty authentic to the experiences of the characters, kind of depicting each in a light that does not fall into that inaccurate portrayal of their experiences. Now, I do feel like the series does fall short in terms of the author's race and also the date of the publication. The date of the publication is something that you cannot change. However, I do feel like the race should have been addressed, the issue of race. So I do feel like the accuracy of the characters throughout this series, as well as the respective storylines, are pretty well rounded and well informed. Each story, like I said, places a pretty clear description onto the experiences of Black individuals and kind of how they combat the struggles throughout their lives. But I will say that the two main issues of this series are, like I said, the author's race and also the date of publication. So we can see that the authors of these books are white. So I feel like it's a lot harder, especially for readers of color, to really feel that 100% authenticity in their words, as they don't really have that firsthand experience onto these issues. And I really do feel like these writings could have been a lot more influential and also educational if the authors were, in fact, people of color. Along with this, these books were primarily written in the early 2000s, which was over 20 years ago. But I do feel like a lot of the depictions that they made still hold accurate to the high school experience today. It's important to note that, of course, things have changed in the high school experience in the last 20, 25 years. So some of the context and the contents noted throughout the text, whether it be the technological devices that they're using or the slang and lingo that they're using might be a little bit outdated to today's portrayal. I do feel like the accuracy of their depiction of students still holds true, even 25 years prior to writing it, or 24 years. So, I want to thank you for your time and kind of reading and looking over and watching my assignment. I found this assignment very beneficial. It's really interesting to get a look into the importance of really diversifying the curriculum and kind of looking into different pieces of work and how influential or de-influential they are, into really diversifying the curriculum and how important it is to have works such as these and take this route and actually learning and understanding them, because too often then we're kind of placed into that status quo of, you need to learn white literature, you need to do assignments based on white historical figures. And I feel like by breaking through that status quo and doing assignments like that, we as students and as future educators can sincerely benefit from that. So thank you for this course, and then also thank you for your time.